from the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
Ludwig von Mises talked about once the government intervenes, it causes unintended consequences. These unintended consequences call for more government intervention, which lead to more unintended consequences and more government intervention until he argued that you finally end up with socialism.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Dr. Gary Wolfram, William Simon Professor of Economics and Public Policy, Director of Economics and Professor of Political Economy at Hillsdale College. He joins us today as we discuss the plan from Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris to enact price controls or price caps. Dr. Wolfram, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, I'm glad to be back.
Talking today about the Harris idea plan for price controls, or as she calls them, price gouging bans. Let's start by defining what we know. What do we know about the Harris plan for price controls, particularly on food, right? Inflation fighting
Yes.
is what she claims.
She started out just talking about food, but more recently she's also talking about rent control. And actually one of the interesting things will be that once you've decided you can do it on food and you can do it on rents, then you've set a precedent, and then the government will end up setting all sorts of prices.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that Nobel Prize winner Milton Friedman, he once said, we economists may not know much about things, but we do know how to create a shortage, and that's price controls.
So how do price controls disrupt the balance in the economy between supply and demand?
Well, I always tell my students, like 9 million people woke up today in New York City and there was exactly the right amount of Starbucks coffee and exactly the right amount of peanuts and everything else. We should just be totally amazed that that's what happens. Every day we should just wake up and say, oh my gosh. And, it'll happen tomorrow, and it happened in Hillsdale, and it happens all around. And that's because of prices. If there's too much of a good out there, we don't just have it piling up, and the shelves keep getting more and more of the stuff. What'll happen is if there's too much of the stuff, then the producers will lower the price and they won't make as much stuff in the future. If there's too little, it's not like, oh, we'll just go, do without. What will happen is there's too little, then what will happen is the producers will raise their price. And as they raise their price, they'll start making more of the stuff and we will buy less of it until eventually we get about to what we call equilibrium,
Mm-hmm.
that the quantity demanded will equal the quantity supplied. And if you have the government comes in and doesn't allow that price mechanism to work, well, you're going to be where, if you know Rocky and Bullwinkle, he'll say, well, somebody must have goofed up somewhere. And that's what's going to happen. So prices are the key mechanism to signal information about how to make markets work. And when the government comes in and says, oh, we don't like what that price is, then you'll always end up with shortages, because they're not going to say the price. We're going to make it so the price can't be lower than this, right? Except for the one thing, which is your labor. They will set a minimum wage, but other than your labor, they're not going to set a price. Then say you can't have a price which is less than that. They always said you can't have a price more than that, and that will always create a shortage. It's sort of interesting that I'm old enough to remember when we had long lines for gasoline.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that we had long lines for gasoline is Richard Nixon imposed price controls on oil. And of course, oil is an input into gasoline. And so less gas was being produced. And so you just have to wait in line for gas.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then Ronald Reagan became president, eliminated the price controls, and the gas lines went away instantly. So, and again, prices are a signal to the market. That's why we don't, for any lengthy period of time, have long waits for anything or have too little of something or too much of something. Now, of course, there are instances where things are moving back and forth. If demand for something is going up really, really quickly, it might take a while. And so you might have shortages in the short run, but there's always going to be a response to that.
Yeah.
If I see that the shelves are empty, I'm going to start raising the price. And like I said, when you raise the price, then people will buy less of it and producers will produce more of it.
Where have we seen price controls lead to shortages in other countries?
There in Argentina, there was price controls. It's sort of interesting that everywhere that you have price controls, you have a shortage. Mm-hmm. There's no question. How do you get rid of them? You get rid of the price controls. And like I said, notice that what will happen too is if you put price controls on rental housing, for example, what's going to happen is there's going to be a shortage of rental housing. So then what will happen is the government will step in and it will then say, we're going to subsidize the production of rental housing. And then what they'll have to do is then they'll start setting the price of cement and they'll start setting the price of steel. And actually, Ludwig von Mises talked about in his book that I have in my class called Liberalism in the Classical Tradition that he wrote in 1927. And he said, once the government intervenes, it causes unintended consequences. These unintended consequences call for more government intervention, which lead to more unintended consequences and more government intervention until he argued that you finally end up with socialism. Now, we're not quite there yet, but we certainly have a good deal more government intervention in the goods and services markets than we did back in 1927 when he wrote the book. And so this price gouging, again, is another case of what we talked about before, about seeing and observing. People think that, oh, wow, the government can go in there and make it so that those darn, Kroger's can't raise the price of food on me, not realizing that, oh, yeah, well, you're not going to have as much food if that's what goes on. And the same in the rental housing market, where if the government imposes rent controls, there will be a shortage of rental housing. That always leads to shortages.
Talking with Dr. Gary Wolfram about price controls and Kamala Harris's price gouging ban proposal. What about investment, innovation in those industries where prices are then artificially capped?
Yes, that's a very good point. The profit and price are the incentive to take on the risk of innovation. Innovation is risky, right? 2 out of every 3 businesses or something like that fail in the first 3 years. When you were Steve Jobs and you decided to drop out of college in order to, produce a phone, you don't know that it's going to work out, right? You have to, and when you're doing something innovative, you have to figure out, how am I going to design it? How am I going to produce it? What's going to be the cost? How much are people willing to pay for such a thing? And the reason that we have computers in our pockets, which we call a phone, which actually have more computing power than the computer that I had at Berkeley when I was getting my PhD.
Right.
The reason is because innovation happens and prices can go up. And so I need to have the ability to raise prices or to get a price above what the government thinks is good for us. I need to be able to get that in order to take on that incentive to innovate. And if that incentive is not there, then we're not going to have innovation. And, Mises talked about that as well in liberalism. But the incentive to take on that risk of innovating is going to be dampened if we know that the government can come in and set the price whenever it thinks that the price has gotten too high.
Kamala Harris would say the price controls are in effect to fight inflation. Do they do anything to inflation? Does that inflation simply move to other sectors that are then not price controlled by the government? What happens?
Well, okay. Inflation is when, and Milton Friedman talked about this as well, inflation is when the supply of money grows faster than output. Mm-hmm. If I want to cause inflation, I could do something that would reduce output. So price controls will reduce output. So realistically, price controls, rather than combating inflation, are going to cause inflation. There'll be people moving. If I'm have price controls on shirts, right? Well, I'll figure out to move to something else, that sweaters or cashmere or something like that. So you create all sorts of like I said, the unintended consequences of these things. We need to think through. If I don't let the price of hot dogs go up, if I fix the price of hot dogs, well, then what's going to happen? People are going to have more hamburgers, right? And it's going to affect the amount of hot dog buns there are. And that'll affect maybe the amount of hamburgers, the amount of hamburger buns. And so things are totally interconnected in a market. You can't just affect one little thing. And people don't sort of realize how interrelated things are until they start, again, like seeing, observing. A price control on one good is not just going to affect that market. It's going to affect substitutes and complement goods that are used with it. Like I said, if I set, a maximum price on hot dogs, that's going to affect hot dog buns, and that's going to affect the amount of flour that's used and all sorts of the other things.
If price controls don't work and never have, what's the next step if they're implemented? Where do they turn next?
Well, price controls are going to cause, as I said before, more and more government intervention, because if you set a price control, you are going to create shortages. That is for sure, because the quantity demanded of this stuff is going to be greater than the quantity supplied at that price, right? Because I can't force people to make the stuff.
Right.
If I set price controls on restaurant food, I can't force restaurants to do that. And so what'll happen is that you'll have the substitutes people will change the demand for substitutes, and that'll affect the prices there. Again, overall inflation is due to the total money supply growing faster than the quantity, and price controls are going to limit the quantity, and that's going to cause more inflation. Now, it may not create price increases in that particular good, but it is going to create price increases in all sorts of other things.
Dr. Gary Wolfram is William Simon Professor of Economics and Public Policy, Director of Economics and Professor of Political Economy at Hillsdale College. We talk about Kamala Harris's idea for price controls. Dr. Wolfram, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Glad to be here again.
Up next, Hans von Spakovsky from the Heritage Foundation joins us to talk about what he calls unlawful interference in state election administration. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding. And we want you, or your son or daughter, to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to follow the show on X. We're at Hillsdale Radio. We're joined now by Hans von Spakovsky. He is manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative and senior legal fellow in the Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. More at heritage.org. Hans, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Talking about a background piece you wrote over at heritage.org a couple of weeks ago, on Joe Biden's Executive Order 14019, unlawful interference in state election administration. What is this Biden executive order all about?
Joe Biden issued an executive order telling all executive branch departments and agencies, everybody from the Department of Defense to the Justice Department, to have all of their personnel get directly involved in voter registration and helping individuals obtain and vote their absentee ballots. This is something that has never happened in the entire history of the United States, of a president basically putting the executive branch of the federal government, getting them involved in elections, which are run by the states. And look, there are just numerous problems with this. I mean, first of all, he's got no constitutional authority to do this. He's got no statutory authority to do this. In fact, when federal personnel, federal employees, are, instead of doing the work they're supposed to be doing, for example, at the Justice Department, are instead registering people to vote, spending money on that, they're violating federal law. There's a law called the Anti-Deficiency Act, which says that federal employees can't spend money on something that Congress hasn't authorized or appropriated money for. So this is really an interference in what the states are doing. And frankly, I think it's a partisan interference in the election.
The order was issued March 7th, 2021. What was the rationale? What was the reason that the Biden administration gave to issue this order?
Well, if you look at the first part of the order, Joe Biden makes all these claims about how all these Americans, particularly minority voters, minority Americans, African Americans, others, are being kept from registering to vote and are being kept from voting. That is complete and total nonsense. I mean, he's making that up. His claims of discrimination, or that state and local officials are keeping Black residents of their states, for example, from registering and voting, there's just no evidence of that whatsoever. In fact, as you may know, in 2020, we had the largest turnout in a presidential election in decades. It even exceeded the turnout of when Barack Obama was elected in 2008, and that was record-setting itself.
Hans, what has the execution of this executive order looked like in terms of actual actions from the executive branch?
Well, part of the problem there is we've been trying to find out for the past 2 years without success, because the Justice Department, in lawsuits filed trying to get information on what these agencies are doing, has claimed that all their actions are subject to presidential executive privilege, so they're not going to say what they're doing. But we have discovered that it's everything from, for example, the U.S. Marshal Service, which handles federal prisoners, people who've been convicted in federal trials, as they are handling those prisoners, as they are taking them to federal prison, they're now have to make sure that they are registered to vote. They have to give them the paperwork for that. They have to help them obtain absentee ballots, despite the fact they have no training in this. And in fact, most states, almost all the states, say you can't vote when you have been convicted of a felony and are in prison. They also have been inviting third-party organizations, supposed nonprofits, but only those on the left side of the political aisle who support the Democratic Party, actually to come into government offices and handle the voter registration ballot obtaining process for these federal agencies, which is, in essence, a way of doing or getting the government involved in a get out the vote campaign for the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates.
Hans von Spakovsky with us. We talk about Biden's Executive Order 14019, interference in the state election administration. More on this backgrounder at heritage.org. There's a piece of the executive order, Hans, that says that every federal agency has to submit a plan, a strategic plan, how they're going to carry out the executive order. I imagine, much as you just outlined, that those plans are not available for us to know. There are probably things happening that we just don't know about.
No, that's exactly right. And in fact, it's those plans which the Justice Department has said, oh, no, we don't have to turn over. They're not subject to Freedom of Information Act requests, which is a very odd position to take. They have even refused to give that information to secretaries of state. More than a dozen secretaries of state from places like Florida and West Virginia wrote to the Biden administration saying, look, we need to know what your federal agencies are doing in our states to avoid chaos and confusion. What are they doing with regard to voter registration, which our election officials have to handle? And the Biden administration has refused to tell them.
Hans, there are some federal agency staffs that are people who apply for Social Security benefits or former members of the military applying for veterans benefits. It is at those opportunities that they are encouraging them, asking them, helping them sign up to vote. That could cause some confusion and perhaps even some intimidation among the voting public, I imagine.
No, I think that is a real problem. That's why the federal government should not be involved in this. Because, look, the individuals who are applying for government benefits, for example, Social Security disability benefits, look, those are vulnerable individuals. Mm-hmm. And when they are applying for benefits and they have the government clerk, the government employee, they're dealing with saying, oh, by the way, we've got your application for benefits. We're reviewing it to see if you're entitled. But in the meantime, you need to register to vote. And can I help you with your absentee ballot? Well, what's that person supposed to think? I'm sure they think, well, I'd better do what this guy is telling me to do, this federal employee. And boy, I better vote for the party in power in the White House or my benefits might not get approved.
Hans, the National Voter Registration Act does allow federal offices to act as voter registration agencies, but only if they've been designated by the state to do so. That does not appear to be the case in many of these instances, or most of these instances. Is this another way that this act is violating, in fact, federal law?
Oh, yeah. What the Biden administration is doing is, in fact, violating the National Voter Registration Act. Yeah, federal offices can become voter registration agencies, the equivalent of DMV offices where you can get registered when you get your driver's license, but only if the state officially appoints them to do that. And in fact, the Biden administration has ignored that requirement, which is why there's now at least 4 lawsuits that have been filed. They were filed late this summer by about a dozen states against the Biden administration, trying to get an injunction to stop this misbehavior by the federal government, in part because it does violate the National Voter Registration Act.
There's current litigation moving through the courts, Ohio, Missouri, Arkansas, Michigan, elsewhere. What is the status of some of those lawsuits?
All of those really are on the preliminary stages. The government normally has twice as long to respond to a lawsuit like that as a private individual. It's just another example of the government having an advantage over the rest of us. And I don't think there have been hearings yet. The plaintiffs in those cases, the states, are asking for hearings so they can get injunctions against the Biden administration. That those haven't happened yet.
Clearly, Hans, we're going to go through the 2024 election without those issues being litigated and with this executive order in place. Is it possible we stretch this out and say the 26th cycle, maybe the 28th cycle, also is operated under conditions in which this executive order continues to be in effect?
Well, sure, because look, it may have been Joe Biden issued this executive order, but it's the Biden-Harris administration. Mm-hmm. And I have no doubt that if Kamala Harris is elected president, she will continue. She's not about to rescind this executive order, so she will continue this, what I consider to be misbehavior by the federal government.
And this is another one of these election-type issues, Hans, that we'll never see or know a direct correlation, A leads to B necessarily, but we can look and say, at the very least, that what has been issued in the executive order is illegal in many ways.
Yeah, although I think there might be some correlation when you note, and this is something I cover in the paper, the federal agencies have been making concerted efforts in some states only in certain areas that demographically they believe benefit the Democratic Party. And I think after the election, if you look at perhaps, well, what happened with turnout in those areas? Was it higher than other parts of the same state? We will have seen what a difference this actually made.
Hans von Spakovsky is manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative and senior legal fellow in the Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. You can find more, including this background piece, at heritage.org. Hans, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Up next, we're joined by Hillsdale English professor Dr. Pat Bart as we begin an exploration into the history of the English language. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Or text the word Imprimis to 71844 and we'll send you a link to sign up for your free lifetime subscription. That's IMPRIMIS to 71844. We're back on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu. Find older episodes of this program, plus lots of great Hillsdale audio. We're joined by Dr. Pat Bart. She is Associate Professor of English here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Bart, thanks for joining us.
And thanks for asking me, Scott. It's great to be here.
We have been looking forward to talking at length, not as at length as possible, but as at length as we can manage, on a wonderfully interesting topic, the history of the English language. And where do we start? This is a large topic that you've spent a lot of time thinking and working and writing on. Where do we start when we talk about the history of the English language?
Well, I thought that I would start sort of egotistically, I guess, with my inspiration for even trying to write a book on the history of the English language, which I'm doing at the moment, in that the traditional textbooks out there, they can be very, very expensive, and they're very strange in the areas in which they don't cover. One of the classic textbooks, has a figure of the human head from the side with the organs of speech. It's labeled the organs of speech, and you've got the tongue, you've got the oral cavity, you've got the teeth, and various things. And there's one really shocking omission in this. You can see, I've given you a copy of it. It has no brain. Okay, so I thought, good grief, language without the brain is difficult at best. When I wake up, I find that that's true.
Yes.
Not being much of a morning person. So there's no lungs or diaphragm either. And as you will talk to me in the course of this conversation, you will see that I tend to talk with my hands too. One talks with the set of one's shoulders. One talks with the tilt of the forehead, the frowning, the facial muscles, even the set of the legs. Actually, as it can say a lot while you're uttering certain words. So you've really got to talk about the whole human being. So that's where we start. That's where we start here at Hillsdale College in the seminar on the history of the English language with sort of the neurology of language.
I want to transition into the next point by saying this. I think it's so interesting. You mentioned talk with your hands. I've hosted a lot of radio shows. I'm here with you now. When there's someone in the room, I talk with my hands. But when I'm all alone in a studio, I still talk with my hands, even though no one is there to see that. So language itself and the English language, it's a whole body experience. You mentioned the brain, the mouth, breathing, hands, movements. It's all connected.
We can think of particularly some parts of the brain where we tend to think of language residing sort of in splendid isolation, which of course it does not do. But there's Wernicke's or Wernicke's area of the brain. That's understanding language coming in at you. Broca's area, which I find a lot of people have heard of Broca's area. That's the language coming back out of you, the production of language and speech and writing. Geschwindt's territory is the last to mature in the brain, interestingly, and it's used in reading and writing. But of course, we talk about speech, then we have to have the ears. And of course, you'd be missing a lot if you weren't looking. It's like, look at me when I talk to you, right? Yeah. What do we do? We do that. And I just pointed at you when I said that. So, right? And why do we do? Well, that really underscores that we want that person's attention, their full attention, their full apprehension. So the eyes, the ears, the hands, they all come together here, not in this kind of splendid isolation. So we also have to talk about the brain as the somatic controller, if you will, the neocortical control of voluntary breathing. And this is kind of interesting. When we fall asleep, we keep breathing, thank heaven. When we're not thinking about breathing, we breathe, thank heaven, because I would forget to breathe if I had to think about it all the time. Well, that's handled by the medulla oblongata. It's really part of the brain stem. It's not really part of this big part of the brain that we think of as the brain. But there's the top part of the brain here is what gives us that control of our bodily movements when we're thinking about it, when we decide we want to make a movement. And of course, we're usually so good at making those movements that we don't really think about it, right? We do it sort of automatically. I mean, if you asked me to foxtrot, yeah, I'd have to think about that. And I would say, no, I wouldn't, because I'm so bad at it. But if I want to just turn on my heel and throw my arm out to make a point in class, I don't think about that at all. It just happens, right? And we rarely think about it. Unless we're ill, we don't really think about the voluntary control of our breath as we speak. You don't think, okay, I want to utter a sentence of 10 words, so I better really take a deep breath. I mean, when do you do that? You do that in choir. I mean, I do that, that's when I do it, right? And I usually run out ahead of time, and then it's embarrassing, but at least it's a choir and not a solo, right? So we don't think about that. The great apes who don't have some of these areas like Broca's area in their brain, they can seem to memorize lists of items, 7 to 10 items on average. And you know what? That's the average that the human can memorize. But they don't have neocortical control of their breathing. They just breathe. So they would have to wait for the next breath to finish the sentence or whatever, even if they learned to speak, which they probably simply can't do, in all probability, right?
How would you compare learning our home language compared to learning a foreign language?
Okay, a lot of people find learning foreign languages very difficult, but I would say there's a lot of insight in, there's a reason for that. There's a lot of insight in calling our home language the mother tongue. It might be controversial with some people, but the earliest caretakers of a child are his or her models for all kinds of development, most particularly for language. And of course, all of those aunts and uncles who hover over you and go, and you think, why did I just do that? I'm imitating the baby who's supposed to be imitating me. What's going on, right? The infant used to be viewed as a tabula rasa, right? A blank slate, that somehow our brain was just clay into which ideas would be pressed or something, and it was just flat. But Noam Chomsky has observed that language is really, by an infant, language is really acquired, he says, rather than learned. And we all know this without realizing it. It's one of these brilliant insights that after the person says it, you think, wow, why didn't we all just assume that, But what parent actually sits down with the kids to teach them every aspect of the English language. Like, nobody does that, right? You teach them some refinements. I know that certain members of my family were always teaching me things like, if I said, me and Scott are going to, no, Scott and I are going to make a recording about the, no. And they would correct me like that. Sure. But the basics of the language, 95 to 99% of what I was learning about the language, I just picked up like a sponge. And so did you. And so does everybody, right? Or when it doesn't happen, we're concerned about that. And we're like, gee, isn't that kid a little bit old to not speak it? Maybe you should have that checked, And so we instinctively know that the human being is somehow pre-programmed to speak. Now, any given language, it just depends on where you're growing up, what you're going to speak.
Dr. Bart, how do babies learn to talk? How is that perhaps similar and different for adults who are learning secondary languages?
The infant babbling that we hear, that we imitate, actually, has been shown to include nearly every possible phoneme that appears in nearly every possible human language. So the baby is actually automatically exercising its mouth, its lungs. Who knows? Those gestures, maybe the baby thinks that means something. and they're going through almost the way a gymnast or a skater goes through these rudimentary movements to get good at them. That's what the baby is actually doing by going, right? And then as we mature into our own mother tongue, native language, that group of sounds begins to narrow, and we start hitting upon certain of them a lot more often than others, and then pretty soon some of those others are just gone. Okay, so you have sounds that people feel awkward about making as adults, like in German or Hebrew, right? Or I don't know. This one seems very hard for people. The sound, and that's not even the hardest one. Some of them are way down the throat. From there, and they either don't want to, or in fact, the musculature in their body is kind of flabby in that area. And then a speaker of another language, their musculature would be flabby in areas that we perhaps use all the time in English and don't even think about it, right? So learning a second language, particularly in adulthood, is more difficult. First of all, because we've lost some of those phonemes. So it's like when you're a little kid and you just kind of play all kinds of sports, and then you become a tennis player. Or, I don't know, have you seen like the arms and shoulders on a swimmer right?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And so they start to specialize, and then, they're an all-around great athlete. But nobody's an all-around perfect athlete, because whatever sport you're in, it kind of trains your body in a certain way, right? So that's part of it. But of course, there's also the part of it where the adult will have a certain shame socially over two things: sounding weird, making those strange sounds, and then sounding stupid because you've made an elementary mistake. And I still learn languages very rapidly, even at my advanced age here. And so I have some really good ones, howlers, to tell about myself. Like one time I presented someone in French a gift, and I called it a gâteau instead of a cadeau. So I have a cake for you, right? Instead of a gift. But an even better one in German, where I said that I hardly ever had the embarrassment, the Verlegenheit to speak German. So that's why my German was a little off that day. Well, of course, it's Gelegenheit is an opportunity, which is what I meant, And of course, the minute I said it, the second I said it, I'm like, I can't believe I said that. But we had a good laugh, So if you stay athletically flexible with the noises you make, and you don't have shame, right? You realize you're the foreigner and you're just trying. Then you might actually find that your ability to learn a foreign language increases greatly.
You used a word a few minutes ago in an answer that people might not be familiar with, phoneme, and then there's morphemes. What are those small blocks of language? Okay,
so those first babbling sounds that the baby makes, they represent all the phonemes of various languages, and they haven't decided amongst them yet for their own language. A phoneme is the smallest building block of any human language. It does not have meaning in itself. I'll make a phoneme. P, p, right? That's the P sound, people would say, right? or th. That's the theta or th sound in English, right? So if we say th, I, n, okay, th, I, and n don't have any meaning by themselves. But then if we say thin, that goes from phoneme to a group of phonemes. The group of phonemes then becomes a morpheme, the smallest unit of meaning in a language. You can add bound morphemes to unbound or free morphemes. You have thin and you have thinnest. I'm not the thinnest person I know, right? Okay, so you can add ist and it changes the meaning, but ist by itself doesn't quite mean much, right? Pin and pinned. My sorority, I got pinned last night or something, right? So I got pinned. And that adds to the meaning, though id or d doesn't really mean anything by itself. Okay, so it's remarkable that infants and young children pick all this up with relatively few mistakes. I mean, including noticing that you add id to something and it makes it in the past or whatever. Yeah. I mean, again, this is the part of the brilliance of Chomsky's insight that you don't have to sit there and tell your kids, okay, now we're going to learn the past tense, okay, and the future and all that. You don't have to say that.
Talking with Dr. Pat Bart about the history of the English language. How do languages develop? How do languages change?
Human beings don't rely on an absolutely precise enunciation of phonemes. Because Southerners, for example, will pronounce, I'm from Pittsburgh, so I say pin and pen, right? But my dissertation director was from East Texas, and he said pin and pin. And they both sounded exactly the same because his dialect fronted the vowel. And likewise, I've heard people, Northerners, it's not just Southerners. I've heard Northerners pronounce, for example, bin, B-E-E-N, I have been, the same way as the man's name Ben. I've been there. I'm like, no, you've been there. What are you talking about? Right? So, and that's backing or retraction. Okay, so that kind of change, as long as it's gradual enough, and as long as it doesn't cause some crucial ambiguity that drives people crazy and causes big gaffes and that sort of thing, that's how language change occurs. That's how we get French from Latin. That the gradual mispronunciations over time, and then we habitually do them, and they all still work. We all still get what's being said, and pretty soon, 100 years go by, and we have a really strong accent, and then 200 or 300 years go by, and we're starting to get really hard for others to understand. Right? That adults misapprehend, they mishear things, and of course, I mean, kids do all the time, but two famous kinds of mishearing, one is related to the other, are eggcorns and mondegreens, right? So there's a ballad said in a Scottish accent, right? Ye Highlands and ye Lowlands, oh, where have ye been? They have slain the Earl of Moray and laid him on the green. And people heard this as they killed the Earl of Moray, but they also killed Lady Mondegreen.
Right.
Like, man, who was she? Right? Where's Mondegreen? Where is that? But if you say Lady Mondegreen, you're not a native speaker of that dialect of English. You try to hear what it's saying and you get it wrong, right? And the same with acorns. Now, I don't know if you say egg or egg, but if you say egg and you say corn together really fast, the G and the C come together and you get eggcorns. And of course you heard that as egg corn, right? I mean, and of course the thing itself is kind of shaped like an egg, some of them, right? Some acorns are kind of egg shaped a little bit. And a corn, it's like a seed, right? So, there are people who go around their whole lives thinking that that's spelled egg corn, and it makes sense, right? And so we adults do the same thing, right? We misapprehend at times, but even in its imprecision, I mean, in some ways, in its imprecision, it makes us laugh. Like Lady Mondegreen, that's great. Oh, that's hilarious. I always knew what that said. I don't know, some rock songs. There are rock songs where you're just like, I have no idea. Yes. I'll listen to songs from back in the 60s when I was like really little. toddler. And I'll think, wait, that's what that says? Oh my gosh, I had no idea, right?
That's how you see the lyric sheet.
I know. You have to totally look at it before you can tell. So
how do we name things? How do we invent words, and then how do they become popularized?
Okay, there's a lot to this. At the beginning of my seminar each time, I set the students out to do a certain kind of experiment, a social experiment. Yes, we do social experimentation at Hillsdale College. Anyway, they have to try to popularize a word or change an element of grammar, pronunciation, or syntax. And they have to have part of their team be the actors, the ones doing this, and the other part of their team being the observers, as though they had no idea this was going on, and it's just happening in front of them. And the new word or new pronunciation has only a faint chance of success. None of them have ever actually succeeded. The changed grammar or syntax is pretty much impossible, and they have reported people just getting irate with them. So, what are you being such a jerk for? Why are you doing this, right? So what is required to popularize something, or what is required even to commit some kind of grammatical error and have people just go along with it? Well, social prestige, right, would be one thing. Now, I think the grammatical error, you'd have to be a dictator, and everybody wanted to suck up to you because they're afraid of dying, And over time, that could actually become part of a language, but probably not in the United States. Probably not. It has to be too many people objecting, right? There also, if there's not a lot of social prestige, but there's a lot of usefulness, if the word meets a real need. Look, we keep having this verbose phrase to refer to something that's an everyday object or activity, and we need something short for that. Then people are going to pick that up and they're going to use it. Okay. A large number of uses per day helps, and sustained over a long period of time, and then wide distribution. Okay, so a lot of new words come up through social media, say something like YouTube or TikTok or the news or the newspaper or blogs or whatever, where somebody invents a term, other people like it. Then since there's such a huge audience, and now especially since that audience can talk back and repost and whatever, that could actually speed up the popularization of a term. I've tried to do that myself just to see as an experiment, and it's never caught on because I don't have that many followers. But
I'm thinking of a specific example here, though, just to interrupt you briefly.
That's fine.
With the idea of a need for something and then something being popularized. So a way to say something is sort of average or not great, not wonderful. And if you go back into popular culture with The Simpsons, and it's this word meh, M-E-H, which is kind of, it's okay, it's not bad. And Futurama, which is another television show, I think it started with them, this word cromulent, which just means kind of in the middle.
I've never heard this. Cromulent. I have to memorize that.
And then these days, just very recently, I've noticed an uptick in people using the word mid, M-I-D, to mean the same thing, to mean just totally average, just in the middle. And the way that's maybe 25 years to a point where people generally understand what you mean if you use those terms.
Right. Yeah. And it's because of the audience, right?
Yes.
And I think cromulent, it just sounds fun. That's why I want to memorize that one, because although to me it sounds a little more
uppity, right?
Violent or something. No, it doesn't sound sort of mid or
right.
Okay. I don't know. Yeah. But that's a whole other story. With words sounding like what they mean.
Okay, Dr. Bart, we'll have to end things there for now. We will pick this conversation back up in just a couple of weeks. Dr. Pat Bart from Hillsdale's English Department joins us as we begin this multi-part series, So Interesting, the History of the English Language. That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Gary Wolfram from Hillsdale's Economics Department, Hans von Spakovsky from the Heritage Foundation, and Dr. Pat Bart. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.wrfh.org. radio.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.